In Minneapolis, a fatal encounter between a federal agent and a U.S. citizen has absolutely ignited a firestorm. Now, this isn't just a local story, it's a real flashpoint that's sparking protests and raising some really urgent questions about the limits of law enforcement power. So today we're going to break down the two conflicting stories, the legal standards at play, and what this all really means for accountability. Okay, so let's start with what we know for sure, the undisputed facts. On January 7, 2026, an ICE agent shot and killed 37-year-old Renee Good. She was a U.S. citizen, a mother of three, and this all happened during an immigration enforcement operation. And that single tragic event is pretty much where everyone stops agreeing and a major conflict begins.
And that conflict? It really comes down to two completely different stories that popped up almost immediately. This is the central puzzle that investigators and, eventually, the courts have to solve. On one side, you have the federal government's account.
So, the Department of Homeland Security's official line is that the agent was acting in self-defense. They're saying the agent genuinely believed his life was in danger, claiming that Renee Good's vehicle was being used as a weapon, and that's what justified using deadly force.
But, and this is a big but, local officials in Minneapolis are telling a totally different story. The city's mayor, Jacob Frey, has come out and publicly said that the self-defense claim is flat-out false. He's insisting that there's video evidence that directly contradicts the federal government's story and shows the shooting was not justified.
So when you put them side by side like this, you can really see just how far apart these two stories are. The federal account is all about the agent's fear and the idea of the car as a weapon. Meanwhile, the local account says the force was unjustified, that there was no real lethal threat, and, this is the key, that they have video to prove it.
So with two stories that just can't both be true, how does the legal system even begin to figure this out? Well, to understand that, we have to look at the very specific laws that say when an officer, any officer, federal or local, is allowed to use deadly force.
And it all boils down to this one question. The answer here isn't based on feelings or what we think should have happened. It's based on a very precise legal standard that's been set by the courts and by the policies of these departments themselves.
And here it is, right from the legal playbook. Deadly force is only justified when an officer has a reasonable perception of an imminent threat of death or serious injury. Now, those two words, reasonable and imminent, are everything. Reasonable means a court has to look at it from the perspective of an officer in that chaotic moment, not with 20/20 hindsight. And imminent means the threat has to be immediate, like happening right now. And it gets even more specific. On top of that general rule, this agent has to follow very specific DHS policies. And these policies are crystal clear, especially when it comes to vehicles. Firing at a moving car is highly restricted. The policy says a car just moving isn't automatically a lethal threat, and that agent should try to get out of the way before they start shooting. And that detail right there, that could be absolutely crucial in this case.
So, knowing those strict rules, especially about vehicles, you have to ask, what happens if the investigation finds the agent was in the wrong? Let's take a look at the potential legal fallout, because the stakes here are incredibly high.
Well, it's not just one path. Think of it like a three-pronged approach to accountability. This isn't just a single investigation. It's a legal process that's going to move forward on three separate but related tracks, and each one is asking a different fundamental question.
And each of these paths can lead to some really serious outcomes. The criminal path asks, did the agent break the law? And that could mean charges anywhere from manslaughter up to murder. The civil path asks, were the victim's constitutional rights violated, which would allow her family to sue for damages. And finally, the federal path asks, did the agent follow policy, which triggers its own internal reviews by the FBI and other agencies.
You know, this whole thing isn't just playing out behind closed doors in courtrooms. The shooting set off an immediate and huge public reaction that's become a major part of this story, and is putting immense pressure on all three of those legal paths we just talked about.
Protests exploded, not just in Minneapolis, but in cities all across the country. And people aren't just demanding accountability for this one shooting. They're asking much bigger questions about federal enforcement tactics and that sometimes rocky relationship between federal and local authorities. So this incident has really become a rallying cry for a much larger movement.
So as the investigations get underway and the dust starts to settle, this whole complicated case really boils down to a few critical, unanswered questions that the legal system now has to face head-on.
First, and this is the big one, was it actually necessary? Was the threat so immediate and so severe that deadly force was truly the only reasonable choice the agent had at that exact moment? Second, did the agent follow the rulebook? We just saw that DHS policy about moving vehicles.
Investigators are going to have to dig in and decide if the agent's actions lined up with that specific policy and, of course, with the broader constitutional standards for using force.
And finally, maybe the most important piece of the whole puzzle, what will that video show? When you have two stories this different that are polar opposites, objective evidence is king. The footage that Mayor Frey mentioned could very well be the single most important factor in deciding which story is true and what the final outcome is going to be.
You know, when you step back, it's clear this incident in Minneapolis is so much more than just one tragic case. It's a real flashpoint where all these complex issues, constitutional law, federal policy, civil liberties, all crash into each other. As these investigations move forward, the answers we get are going to have an impact that reaches far, far beyond this one tragic event.